Emily had never truly understood why her stepmother, Vivian, seemed to loathe her. At 17, she found herself constantly walking on eggshells, trying to avoid the cold glares and passive-aggressive comments that Vivian never failed to throw her way. Living under the same roof as her father and Vivian was like existing in a house of glass, fragile, full of tension, and inescapable. Emily often wondered what had sparked this animosity. Was it because she was a reminder of the woman who came before her, her mother, whose memory was still fresh in the family despite her passing years ago? Or was it something deeper, something about her that Vivian could never accept? The house itself seemed to mirror the strained relationships inside. Quiet, empty. Every day felt like a battle between what was left unsaid and the awkward silences that filled the spaces between them. The walls felt as if they were closing in, and Emily's attempts to speak, to reach out, were met with indifference. She tried to draw her father's attention, to plead for understanding, but he was often lost in his own world, too wrapped up in his work, or worse, too blind to see the emotional toll Vivian's treatment was taking on his daughter. In the rare moments when Emily would attempt to explain her side, her father would simply shrug it off, attributing the tension to adjusting to the new family dynamic. But this wasn't just an adjustment. This was something more, a subtle, pervasive cruelty that Emily could feel every time Vivian entered the room, like an invisible force pressing down on her chest. And all the while, her father remained oblivious, leaving Emily feeling more isolated and alone than ever before. She couldn't escape the feeling that there was more to Vivian's hatred than just jealousy or resentment. It felt like a deep-rooted disdain, one that she had no idea how to confront or understand. Vivian's cruelty had always been subtle, like a slow poison working its way through Emily's daily life. It wasn't loud or violent, nothing that could be easily pointed to, but it was there, in the way Vivian would raise an eyebrow when Emily entered a room, or the snide remarks she made when no one else was listening. At family gatherings, Emily was always on the outskirts. While her father and Vivian mingled with guests, Emily was left alone, her presence barely acknowledged. She could feel the eyes of others passing over her as if she were invisible. And when they did notice, Vivian was quick to make a pointed comment about Emily's appearance or mannerisms, something seemingly innocent that always made her feel small. One evening, during a dinner party, Emily watched as Vivian made her usual remarks, this time in front of guests. She'd criticized Emily's dress, saying it was too plain for a special occasion, and then, in a voice just loud enough for everyone to hear, casually mentioned how Emily's clumsy ways had always been a family trait. It was humiliating, but the worst part was her father's reaction, or rather, his lack of one. He chuckled awkwardly and changed the subject, oblivious to the sting in Emily's chest. That night, as the house fell silent and Emily tried to sleep, she heard voices drifting from the kitchen. Her father and Vivian were speaking, unaware that Emily was awake and listening. She could hear the tension in their conversation, Vivian's sharp words cutting through the air. Then she heard it, something that made her blood run cold. "You know," Vivian said softly, her voice tinged with a bitterness Emily had never heard before. "Her presence complicates things. You should have thought about that before everything changed." There was a long pause, and then Emily's father responded in his usual calm manner. "I don't see why it's an issue. She's just a kid, Vivian." But Vivian wasn't done. "You don't get it, do you? The past—" She trailed off, her voice dropping to a whisper. Emily strained to hear, but the rest of the conversation was drowned out by the sound of dishes being put away. The cryptic words hung in the air long after the conversation ended, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. What did Vivian mean? Her presence complicates things. Emily was left with more questions than answers, the conversation like a puzzle with missing pieces. Why did Vivian speak of the past in such a way? And why was Emily's very existence something that seemed to unsettle her stepmother so much? The suspicion that there was more to Vivian's disdain than simple jealousy began to grow within her. Determined to find out what was really going on, Emily decided to look into Vivian's past. She had always been curious about the woman who had become a part of her life so suddenly. But now, with the strange words echoing in her mind, that curiosity had turned into something more urgent, a need to understand the root of the tension between them. The idea of asking her father outright didn't seem like a viable option. He was always so dismissive of her concerns. No, Emily would have to investigate on her own. One afternoon, while Vivian was out shopping and her father was busy with work, Emily saw her chance. She quietly made her way to Vivian's room, the door to which was always locked. With her heart pounding, Emily picked the lock, a skill she'd learned over the years from watching her father. She stepped inside, the air smelling faintly of lavender and something older, more musty, as if the room itself had secrets to keep. The room was neat and tidy, far more organized than Emily's own, but what caught her attention wasn't the decor. It was a small wooden chest sitting at the foot of the bed. She opened it cautiously, her fingers trembling. Inside, she found an old photo album, its pages yellowed with age. Her curiosity piqued. Emily flipped through the pages, but it was one photo that made her freeze. There, in a worn photograph, was Vivian, much younger, smiling with a man who wasn't Emily's father. The man had a look of familiarity that sent a shiver down Emily's spine, though she couldn't place it. The image felt wrong, out of place, like a missing piece of the puzzle that she had yet to put together. The picture unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. There was something in the way Vivian looked at the man, the closeness between them, that felt far too intimate to simply be a distant memory. Emily's mind raced, her suspicion growing stronger. Vivian had a past, a history that was clearly tied to this man, someone Emily had never heard of, someone who had been a part of Vivian's life long before Emily had ever come into the picture. That photo ignited a new fire in Emily. There was something her stepmother wasn't telling her, something buried deep in the past, and Emily was determined to find out what it was. The unease that had plagued her for so long was now matched with an urgency she couldn't ignore. The pieces were out there, scattered in the past, and Emily was ready to put them together. As the days passed, Emily's suspicions continued to gnaw at her. Vivian's behaviour had grown even more peculiar, more guarded. There were moments when Emily would walk past her stepmother's study and catch a glimpse of her hurriedly locking a drawer that had never been locked before. The sound of the key turning in the lock echoed in Emily's mind, stirring her curiosity even more. What was inside that drawer? What could be so important that Vivian would go to such lengths to keep it hidden? Emily knew she couldn't ignore this any longer. She had to find out what Vivian was hiding. One evening, when her father was out for a late meeting and Vivian was in the kitchen preparing dinner, Emily slipped quietly into the study. The drawer stood there, as it always had, locked but seemingly vulnerable. Emily had noticed the key earlier that week, tucked inside Vivian's purse when she wasn't looking. It had been so easy to take, so easy to slip into her pocket without anyone noticing. With the key in hand, Emily returned to the study. Her heart raced as she slid the key into the lock, turning it slowly, carefully, praying that Vivian wouldn't walk in on her. The drawer opened with a soft creak, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. Inside, neatly folded, was a letter, an unsigned letter that looked as though it had been deliberately hidden from view. It was the kind of letter you didn't want anyone to find, the kind that had been kept in the dark for a reason. Emily unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words quickly. The letter appeared to be from a lawyer, its tone formal and cold. It mentioned her biological mother, Sophia, a name Emily hadn't heard in years. The letter referenced an inheritance, one that Emily had never known about. The lawyer spoke of financial assets, a trust, and specific conditions tied to the inheritance that Emily had to fulfill. The last line of the letter sent a chill down her spine. This matter must remain confidential, as per the instructions of the late Mrs. Sophia James. The realization hit Emily like a ton of bricks. This inheritance, this fortune, was what Vivian had been hiding, what had driven her to treat Emily with such disdain. It was clear now. Vivian's hatred wasn't just about Emily's presence in the house, it was about the money, the inheritance that belonged to Emily, the inheritance that Vivian had been keeping from her. Suddenly, everything made sense. Vivian's coldness, her harsh treatment, the constant undermining. It had all been motivated by jealousy, greed, and resentment over something Emily never even knew existed. Emily's hands trembled as she reread the letter, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. How long had Vivian known about this inheritance? Why hadn't her father ever mentioned it? And why had no one told her about this trust her mother had left her? The more Emily thought about it, the more questions piled up, each one more urgent than the last. With the letter clutched tightly in her hands, Emily felt a rush of emotions, anger, confusion, betrayal. She had been living under the same roof as a woman who had been lying to her, a woman who had been using her father's obliviousness to her advantage. The tension between her and Vivian had always been suffocating, but now it had a face, a reason. The inheritance was the prize, and Emily was the key to it all. Determined to get answers, Emily decided to confront her father. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she had to know the truth. She found him in his study that evening, sitting behind his desk, absorbed in paperwork. His calm demeanor did little to reassure her. Taking a deep breath, Emily walked in, the letter still clenched in her hand. "Dad, we need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Her father looked up, his expression softening. "What's going on, sweetheart?" "I found something," Emily began, holding up the letter. "Something you should have told me a long time ago. This letter. It's about Mom and an inheritance. I never knew about it. Why didn't you tell me?" Her father's face immediately changed, his eyes narrowing. He took the letter from her and glanced at it briefly before setting it down on the desk, his fingers pressing against his temple as if trying to collect his thoughts. "Emily, this isn't something you need to worry about," he said, his tone evasive. "It's just, this is complicated. Your mother's situation was complicated, and this inheritance, it doesn't concern you right now. Complicated. How is this complicated?" Emily's voice cracked with frustration. "This inheritance, it's mine, isn't it? Why didn't you tell me about it? Why didn't you tell me anything?" Her father sighed deeply, rubbing his face with his hands. "It's just, this is all old news. Your mother's past, her choices, they've caused enough problems already. I didn't want you to get caught up in it." Emily's heart sank. Caught up in what? What are you hiding? But before her father could respond, the door to the study swung open, and there stood Vivian, her expression tight with anger. "What's going on in here?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing when she saw the letter on the desk. "Vivian, Emily began, but Vivian cut her off. "You think you can just go through my things, snoop around like that?" Vivian's voice was low and dangerous. "You have no right." "I'm not just snooping," Emily snapped, her anger flaring. "I'm trying to understand why you've been treating me like this. Why you've been hiding everything from me." Vivian stepped forward, her eyes flashing with fury. "I warned you, Emily. If you keep digging, you're going to regret it. You have no idea what you're getting into." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The tension between them had reached a boiling point, and she could feel the walls closing in. But she wasn't going to back down. She had come too far to let Vivian intimidate her now. "I won't stop until I know the truth," Emily said, her voice steady with resolve. Vivian's face twisted with disdain. "Then maybe it's time for you to leave. You're causing nothing but trouble." Her father remained silent, his gaze flickering between Emily and Vivian. Emily could see the conflict in his eyes, but it wasn't enough to stop her. She had come this far, and now there was no turning back. As Vivian stormed out of the room, Emily's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about an inheritance anymore. This was about the lies, the secrets, and the betrayals that had been buried for too long. She wasn't going to let them stay hidden. And so, with the letter still in her hand, Emily made a decision. She would find out everything, no matter the cost. The truth would come to light, even if she had to uncover it piece by piece, one secret at a time. The confrontation had been a long time coming, and Emily's heart pounded as she made her way toward Vivian's study. Armed with the knowledge of the inheritance, the letter, and the haunting suspicions she'd been piecing together for weeks, Emily felt a mixture of dread and determination. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. She couldn't keep ignoring the elephant in the room, the underlying cause of all the tension and hatred. Vivian had to know that Emily knew the mask of civility had to come off. She had to face her stepmother and demand the truth. Emily found Vivian sitting at her desk, her back turned as she sorted through papers. The room was eerily quiet, the usual sense of unease that permeated the house heavier than ever. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Vivian," she called, her voice steady but sharp. Vivian didn't turn around at first. She simply adjusted a few papers on the desk, making Emily feel as if she were invisible for a moment longer. Then, slowly, she looked up, her eyes narrowing in a way that sent a cold chill down Emily's spine. "What do you want, Emily?" Vivian asked, her tone a mix of annoyance and thinly veiled hostility. "I want the truth," Emily said, her voice unwavering. "I want to know what you've been hiding from me, what you've been keeping from Dad, and from everyone." Vivian stiffened, her hand going still on the papers. "What are you talking about?" she replied, her voice dangerously calm. Emily's eyes flashed with anger. "You've been treating me like I'm a burden, like I don't belong here. You've been manipulating my dad, making him blind to what's really going on. You've been hiding the truth about my mother, and about the inheritance she left me. I know everything now. The letter, the past. It all makes sense. Why didn't you tell me the truth, Vivian?" The silence that followed was thick with tension. Vivian's gaze flickered with something, fear maybe, or guilt. But before Emily could process it, Vivian snapped. Her eyes filled with fury as she stood up from her desk, knocking over a stack of papers in the process. "You think you know everything?" Vivian spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You're just a child, Emily, a child who doesn't know the first thing about what's really going on." Emily's heart raced, but she refused to back down. "Then tell me, Vivian, tell me why you hate me so much. Why are you trying to tear this family apart?" Vivian's chest heaved as she took a step forward, her eyes locked on Emily with a cold intensity. "I don't hate you," she said through gritted teeth. "I hate what you represent. I hate that you're here, that you exist. Do you think I don't know what your mother was to him? Do you think I don't know that I was the one left behind?" The sudden shift in Vivian's tone caught Emily off guard. The woman in front of her wasn't the cold, distant stepmother she had come to expect. She was a woman consumed by years of bitterness and unspoken pain. The truth was spilling out, and Emily didn't know whether to feel relief or fear. "I was in love with your father," Vivian continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "I loved him before your mother even came into the picture. I thought we had something real. But then she showed up and everything changed. He chose her. And when she died, you were the result of her leaving him. You, your very existence, feels like a betrayal to me. Every time I look at you, I see her. And I hate that. I hate you for it." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. For years, she had wondered what she had done wrong, why Vivian had treated her with such disdain. But hearing it now, hearing that the root of Vivian's hatred was jealousy, the kind of jealousy that festered into something darker, it shook Emily to her core. Vivian's anger didn't stop there. The tears that had started to gather in her eyes were now freely streaming down her face as she continued. "I didn't just lose him. I lost myself too. I've spent my entire life carrying this hatred for you because you're a constant reminder of how I was replaced. You're the one who stole everything I thought I could have. And now you're going to take everything from me again, aren't you? She glanced at the letter, her voice bitter and accusing. You think you can just waltz in here and claim what's mine, don't you? Emily stood there, reeling from the revelation, but she didn't give in to the fury that rose in her chest. Number. She had come too far, fought too hard to let this moment slip away. I didn't steal anything from you, Emily said, her voice quiet but firm. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask for the inheritance, and I certainly didn't ask for this hatred. But I'm not going to let you keep hiding the truth. There's more to this, Vivian. I can feel it. Vivian's eyes flickered, a flash of something passing through them. For a moment, she looked like she might say something, but instead she turned away, her hands trembling as she reached for the chair to steady herself. You think this is just about money, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not, Emily. It's never been about the inheritance. It's about what I did. It's about what I caused. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Emily's breath caught in her throat. What was Vivian saying? What could she possibly have done to make her so consumed by guilt? Vivian looked back at Emily, her face pale and drawn. The man in the photo, the one with me, he wasn't just anyone. He was someone who was supposed to be a part of your mother's life. He was supposed to be with her, but I interfered. I hurt her. And that hurt led to everything that happened. Your mother's death, your father's grief. I was a part of that, Emily. I was the one who took him away from her, and now you're the one who's come back to take everything from me. Emily's mind spun as she processed the weight of Vivian's words. The jealousy was there, yes, but so was the guilt. The man in the photo wasn't just a past lover. He was connected to something much deeper, something tragic that had destroyed lives. Vivian's anger, her coldness, had been a way of shielding herself from the deep, unbearable guilt she had carried all these years. Vivian, Emily whispered, her voice shaking. I had no idea. I never knew. Vivian's eyes met hers, raw with the pain of a woman who had spent too long buried under the weight of her own regrets. No one ever told you, did they? No one ever told you the truth about how your mother died, or how I played a role in it. The truth was coming to light now, but Emily wasn't sure whether it was a relief or a curse. Either way, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't backing down. She had already taken the first step toward the truth, and now she had no choice but to face it head on. Vivian's world was unraveling, and Emily was left standing in the middle of it, unsure of where it would lead, but determined to find out. The room felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of truth and guilt. Vivian stood there, trembling, her face pale and drawn as she processed the enormity of what she had just confessed. Her shoulders sagged as if all the years of hiding, of building walls, had finally come crashing down. She was no longer the cold, distant stepmother who had so effectively shielded herself with cruelty. She was just a woman, broken, regretful, and finally facing the consequences of her past. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into the chair behind her, burying her face in her hands. Her sobs echoed through the room, raw and jagged, like the release of a lifetime of pent-up emotions. Emily stood frozen, watching her stepmother unravel before her eyes. For a moment, she didn't know what to feel. Part of her wanted to lash out, to expose every lie, every manipulation, to tear down the walls Vivian had built. She had the power now. The truth was in her hands, a weapon that could destroy everything. But then there was another part of her, the part that had always felt the weight of the broken family. The part that wanted to understand, to heal. Was she ready to destroy what little was left of her family? Emily felt a surge of conflicting emotions. She could expose Vivian's guilt, reveal everything that had been buried for so long, and maybe even take the inheritance for herself. She could punish Vivian for all the years of pain, all the subtle cruelties that had poisoned her life. But what would that accomplish? What would she gain by tearing everything apart? Her heart ached as she looked at Vivian, who now sat before her, broken and vulnerable. She had always seen Vivian as the enemy, the woman who had taken her father's attention away from her, who had made her feel like an intruder in her own home. But now, with the truth laid bare, Emily saw something else. She saw a woman who had made mistakes, who had been consumed by jealousy and regret, who had never dealt with her own demons. She saw someone who was just as lost as Emily had been, struggling to find a place in the world, trying to reconcile the past with the present. Emily's mind raced. Do I want to punish her? Or do I want to find a way to heal? The silence between them stretched on, heavy and thick. Finally, Emily took a step forward. Vivian, she said softly, her voice steady but filled with something deeper, something she hadn't expected to feel. You've done a lot of terrible things. And I'm not going to pretend that it didn't hurt, but I'm not going to destroy everything just because of your mistakes. Vivian's sobs quieted, and she looked up, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She said nothing, but her gaze was filled with disbelief, as though she couldn't comprehend what Emily was saying. I don't need your approval anymore, Emily continued, her voice firmer now. I've spent too long wanting it, needing it. But I've realized that I don't need to live my life for you or anyone else. I don't need you to love me, and I don't need to make you like me. Vivian's lips trembled as she listened. She opened her mouth to speak, but closed it again, unsure of how to respond to this unexpected turn of events. I won't expose everything, Emily said, her words deliberate, each one heavy with meaning. Not because you deserve mercy, but because I deserve peace. I won't let this hatred consume me. I'm willing to forgive, not for your sake, but for mine. I don't want to carry this anger anymore. Vivian stared at Emily in stunned silence. The weight of Emily's words seemed to settle into the air between them, a quiet but profound moment of grace. For the first time, Emily saw a flicker of something in Vivian's eyes, a vulnerability, a flicker of guilt, but also something that had been missing for so long, the possibility of redemption. For a long moment, Vivian didn't speak. She just sat there, her hands wringing together, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. Emily could feel the air shift, as if the walls between them were crumbling, brick by brick, with each word spoken. Finally, Vivian's voice came, weak but sincere. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her hands trembling. I never meant for any of this to happen. I never meant to hurt you, Emily. I've carried this guilt for so long, but I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to make things right. Emily's heart softened at the admission. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was the first step, a glimpse of the woman who had been hiding beneath the layers of bitterness and resentment. Emily knew that healing wasn't going to happen overnight. Forgiveness was a long road, and there were still many wounds that needed to be healed, but this was the beginning. You can't change the past, Emily said gently. But maybe you can start by being honest. Start by being a little less cold, a little less distant. Start by trying. Vivian nodded slowly, the tears still glistening in her eyes. She was no longer the villain Emily had always seen her as. She was just a woman who had made mistakes, just like anyone else. And for the first time, Emily felt like she could breathe. I'll try, Vivian said, her voice barely a whisper. I promise I'll try. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It wasn't the closure that Emily had once dreamed of. But it was enough. In that moment, Emily knew that she had made the right choice, not to destroy, but to heal, not to tear everything apart, but to offer the chance for something better. As Emily turned to leave the room, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The past was still there, still looming over them both, but it no longer had the power to control her. For the first time, she felt free. And as she walked out, she heard Vivian's voice, soft but sincere, calling after her. "Thank you, Emily. Thank you for giving me a chance." Emily didn't look back. She didn't need to. For the first time in years, she felt like she was finally moving forward. The days that followed the confrontation were quiet, almost deceptively so. The tension in the house had shifted, no longer as thick or suffocating as it once had been. Emily and Vivian hadn't become friends, nor did Emily expect them to be. But something had changed. They no longer ignored each other in the same way. There was an unspoken understanding now, a fragile truce built on the weight of truth and the promise of change. It wasn't forgiveness in the way that Emily had always imagined it, nor was it an instant healing of the wounds between them. But it was a start. The house, once a place of constant conflict and cold silences, felt quieter now. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over it for so long had lifted, if only just enough to let a breath of peace flow through. Emily no longer felt like an intruder in her own home. She had no illusions that things were perfect, but the oppressive weight that had followed her everywhere she went was gone. For the first time, she felt like she had a voice in the house. She wasn't a victim of Vivian's cruelty anymore. She had found her own strength, a strength that came from confronting the truth and refusing to let it define her. Her father, still blissfully unaware of the full scope of everything that had transpired, seemed to sense the shift. There was less tension between him and Vivian now. Though the cracks were still there, they were no longer festering in the same way. Emily chose not to push him for more answers. Some truths were too painful to fully uncover. She had made her peace with that. The healing between her and Vivian would take time. Neither of them was the same person they had been when this all started. Emily had grown stronger, more certain of who she was and what she was capable of. She had learned that sometimes forgiveness wasn't about the other person. It was about reclaiming your own peace. In forgiving Vivian, Emily had liberated herself. She no longer needed her stepmother's approval to feel worthy. She no longer needed the validation that had always seemed just out of reach. One afternoon, Emily stood at the door, her bag slung over her shoulder, ready to step out into the world with a newfound sense of purpose. She was no longer the uncertain girl who had entered this house all those years ago. She was a young woman, confident in her identity and her strength. The path ahead wasn't clear, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she had control over it. As she walked out the door, she glanced over her shoulder. Vivian was standing in the doorway, watching her. There was no anger, no bitterness in her gaze, only something that Emily couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe. Or perhaps just the quiet acknowledgement of what had passed between them. Emily didn't stop to say anything. She didn't need to. The future was hers now, and for the first time she felt ready to face it head on. With each step she took away from the house, she left behind the girl she used to be, the one who had lived in fear of rejection, who had been weighed down by guilt and the ghosts of her mother's past. She walked on, confident in the knowledge that the journey ahead was hers to make, and that no matter what came, she had the strength to face it.